think we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone, both online on Zoom and also here at the Jewish Community Center. Welcome to the first event and first author of the second annual Acclaimed Author Series, a Jewish experiences program and a collaboration between the Jewish Federation and the J. My name is Ethan Helfand, and I am the Director of Jewish Experiences here at the J. And I am thrilled that this year we're able to both be in person and online. Last year we were virtual for pretty much everything, so happy to be here. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Just for their next headshot.
Our author is virtually joining us today from Chicago, and many of you are online, so I just want to give a few quick Zoom-related housekeeping items. If you are on Zoom, we ask that you mute yourselves during our presentation, and I want to encourage you to use speaker view. That will allow you to see both Dr. Klein and Dr. Cohen fully during our conversation. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, if you click on the button that says View, then you can select Speaker View, and that will allow you to see both of them. Following their discussion, we'll be taking questions via chat, so you can feel free to put questions in the chat, or if you're here in person, we invite you to raise your hand. And at any point during the discussion, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in, and then we'll get to them when we get to the Q&A. I want to thank the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education for partnering with us again this year to bring important voices like Dr. Deborah Cohen to our community. This evening's program and the entire Acclaimed Author Series would not be possible without our partners at the Jewish Book Council, who work tirelessly to bring communities like our own and partner them with stories, authors, and books that expand the ways we think about Jewish identity. And I also, of course, want to thank each of you for joining us. Two quick plugs before we begin. We have two more virtual author events in the next few weeks, including next week when journalist Gabrielle Glasser will join us to discuss her book, American Baby. And then 2 weeks after that, when Dr. Adam Stern will be joining us to discuss his book, Committed. And then we hope you'll join us in March when we have 4 authors joining us in person for another round of Acclaimed Author events. Also, I should be remiss if I say that if you're a theater goer, this weekend our presentation of The Addams Family begins in our very own White Theater, and tickets are still available, and we'd love to encourage you to go see a show as well. And all the details about all of these events and everything else happening at the J is available on our website. The last person I want to introduce and thank is our moderator for today's event, Dr. Shelley Klein. Shelley is a historian and the director of education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education here at the Jewish Community Campus. She received her PhD from the University of Kansas, and her research focuses on the SS Aufschreien. Did I get it right?
Aufzerren.
Well, so close.
So close.
In the concentration camp system and the gendered perpetration of the Holocaust. Her research has been supported by grants from the University of Kansas and the University of Hamburg, and she's presented at national and international conferences and also teaches at the University of Kansas and previously at the Kansas City Art Institute. As part of our award-winning Milton School, Dr. Klein will be teaching a 2-part mini course on the rise of the Nazi Party and Nazi propaganda that starts in early November. And I'd like to encourage all of you to consider joining her class. And I will put the details in the chat, and we will also send it out to everybody via email tomorrow with a survey about our event tonight. We're also excited to offer a sister class about the Holocaust as reflected in diaries taught by Professor Don Gale of Johnson County Community College that will start in January. And lastly, on a personal note, I'm beyond excited to have Dr. Klein here with us today and have her voice and leadership in our community. I'm always grateful for her vision and her community mindedness and her openness to true partnership and collaboration with the rest of the Jewish community. So thank you, Shelley, for being here today and for all that you do to support our community. And with that, no further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Shelley Klein.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you for inviting me here and always being willing to partner with MCHE. As you said, we've done some great partnerships, and I'm looking forward to many more in the future. So thank you, and to second Ethan's welcome to everyone, thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited about the conversation we're about to have. Let me introduce, without any further delay, our author for this evening. Our author was raised in Louisville, Kentucky. She lives in Chicago, where she is the Richard W. Leopold Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Northwestern University. She regularly writes for The Atlantic on subjects ranging from punk rock to World War I photography. Her essay about Anglo-Argentine families was published in Past and Present, and she wrote about consumerism and mega factories in the New York Review of Books. As her family can attest, she spends way too much time at flea markets, which sounds like a fantastic pastime to me. So thank you so much for joining us here this evening to discuss Last Call at the Hotel Imperial. Are there anything, before I dive in with some questions I have for you, is there anything you'd like to say at the beginning to sort of set us up?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much to Dr. Klein. Thank you for joining me this evening. And thank you also to Ethan Helfand for organizing this event, and all of you for coming. I'm really, really happy to be here. So Last Call at the Hotel Imperial is about a group of journalists, American foreign correspondents, who were young people in the 1920s and restless. And they went to Europe and to Asia, where they found themselves really reporting on two main stories. One of them was the rise of fascism across the European continent. And the second was the rise of anti-colonial nationalism. So the figures like Gandhi and Nehru who were battling against the European empires. And then along the way, they found a third story too. And that's also part of what the book is about, which is the ways in which the stories that they're reporting came in a way to haunt their inner lives and to affect almost everything that they did, the way they raised their families and their marriages, the ways that they thought about themselves, and the kinds of books that they eventually wrote. So that's a sort of broad overview, and then we'll dig into the specifics. Is that okay?
Yes, yes, perfect. Right. Could you maybe to start with tell us how you came to this topic, because it is, it's such a fascinating array of characters. So what brought you to the topic, and how did you pick these main four characters that you write about?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a historian of Europe, and I had read these journalists. So I'm guessing that many of them, or some of this group, will be familiar with them. So John Gunther is one of the journalists. His books, Inside USA, Inside Europe, and Inside Asia, I'm guessing were either on your shelf or on your parents' or on your grandparents' shelves. These were books that sold billions and millions of copies. Dorothy Thompson is another one of the figures in my book, and she was recently in the Ken Burns documentary, so you may have seen her there. She was the first American woman to have a political column of her own, and she was writing in the late 30s to an audience of between 8 and 10 million readers thrice weekly. So, and many of those columns taken up with her anti-Nazi crusade. So I came to them actually through Gunther, which is I had read Gunther's book, Death Be Not Proud, as a kid because my mother had been assigned it as a middle schooler in Louisville. And I finished a book and I was sort of thinking about what to do. And I was writing a little piece that was about the best books about parents and children. And so I went back to Death Be Not Proud in that context. And I'll be curious to know actually from the audience, how many of you read it and whether you were assigned it in school. And Gunther's papers are at the University of Chicago. Usually my archives are about 6,000 miles away. So it seemed like a novelty. And I was looking at the letters that grieving parents had written to him, because he said something in the second edition of his book that after Death Be Not Proud was published in 1949, that he got thousands and thousands and thousands of letters from people saying that this was a book that finally gave voice to their experience. So I started there, and those letters were fascinating and heartrending. But then I became really interested in the rest of Gunther's collection, which were, interviews that he had with some of the most important political figures of the day. For instance, he goes to interview Leon Trotsky in exile off of the coast of Turkey, and in 1931. And it was like I'm reading notes from an interview with Trotsky, and it seemed like history, which after all was what I have been doing as like Dr. Klein, but it was like there, like you could touch it. You knew what it felt like to sit in the same room with Trotsky. So I became interested in him, and then like the project just kept growing. So the book is about, as I said, it's about Gunther, it's about Thompson, about a journalist named H.R. Knickerbocker, and about another journalist named Vincent Sheehan, who became famous for his book, Personal History, published in 1935. And they were a tight-knit set of reporters, but they were also friends, and they were also rivals.
I mean, that was one of the things that was so compelling about the book, I thought, is how they're so connected to each other, and then how their lives touch out on all of these other famous people that we know so well now, but we're just, they're friends. Like, Rebecca West pops in a number of times, which is, just interesting to see them. I think, a lot of the book helps you see them as people, right? Not just like historical characters, but real or historical actors, but people. I love the fact that you included women in this set. Could you speak a little bit about the role of gender, both in how you put the women in, but then also how that that thread throughout the book?
Yeah, it's one of the things that's just hugely interesting about this group. And so foreign correspondence, let me just back up just to say foreign correspondence as a profession where Americans were sent out to report on the world was a relatively new field at this time. So American papers had had wire service, Reuters and the Associated Press, they had carried those kinds of reports. And those were largely also reports that were coming from the kind of local national papers. After the First World War, American newspaper proprietors felt like they wanted to hire Americans to report those stories from abroad. So foreign correspondence in that sense is a new field, and it's one in which American women gain a really extraordinary foothold. So Dorothy Thompson is, in a way, she's a unicorn, right? In a way, her indomitability is incredible. But you look sideways and Sigrid Schultz reporting for the Chicago Tribune from Berlin, or Anne O'Hare McCormick reporting for the New York Times. Again, these are all foreign correspondents. Or more famous to us, Martha Gellhorn reporting from the Spanish Civil War and marrying Hemingway. And in a way, it's on and on and on. So Thompson comes into my book. John Gunther marries a sometimes foreign correspondent named Frances Feynman Gunther. So she figures as well. And you get the sense of how women in a field that is a relatively new field are able to make a claim for themselves, especially when they have good language skills. And remember that this is a group of women who, in the early 1920s, they're nearly half of all university educated Americans, a high point in women's higher education. So they have these kinds of opportunities. I think there's something else that's important though too, which is that the 1930s are a time where emotions run incredibly high, and there's a kind of personal quality to the journalism. And precisely for that reason as well, people like Dorothy Thompson or Frances Feynman Gunther, for that matter, are able to translate a kind of intuition that they have about the kinds of news that the public wants to read: subjective, personal, engaged, emotional, and really turn that into audience numbers.
Would you say, I mean, I had never thought about the differences between, because foreign correspondence was a relatively new role, because it was kind of a new thing, was there a greater space for women in foreign correspondence as opposed to like on a domestic beat?
Yeah, I think that's right. And in other words, there was more room for women in foreign parts abroad than there was absolutely in the big city newsrooms, where you would get shuffled off. And this is something Dorothy Thompson complains about. You get shuffled off to, reporting on the garden party or the latest styles in hats or what kind of compact you should use for your makeup. And so for her, she sees Europe as being sort of a more native habitat, as she puts it, for women, that women can be taken seriously in the salon that they will be taken seriously by politicians. Now, that's not really true for, say, British women foreign correspondents who have a very hard time breaking in to a pretty clubby environment. But it's certainly for these American women, they have careers that their counterparts, especially in Britain, really envy. And as you say, their counterparts at home too.
Right, right. So maybe let's talk a little bit about what brings these American correspondents from the US. What's the drive that makes them go essentially overseas?
Yeah, I mean, they're young, right? These are people who were born in the last years of the 19th century or just right around the turn of the century. So when they go, they're in their 20s, they're impatient. They loathe what they would, view as the kind of American prudery and moralism. They come from the Midwest, many of them. They come from small towns, or they come from places that they view as, not really partaking of high culture and civilization. And so they have a kind of yearning for wide horizons and for European culture. Most of them want to be novelists, so they go off in kind of a lost generation mode, right? In Hemingway and Fitzgerald, but instead of sitting around drinking cocktails, on the left bank, instead they find themselves drawn into international political causes. So they are really fascinated by anti-colonialism. And, what is it that leads people to fight and die? They're really fascinated, in some cases fascinated, in some cases appalled by Soviet communism. And so they find themselves almost sort of drawn into these events. But, as to I think the sense, what causes them to go is the sense that they're sort of fed up with America, that they want to see, where the action is.
Well, I really enjoyed this like Midwestern twist that that these weren't the, East Coast people, they were Midwesterners. How do you think that particular aspect of their background influenced the type of reporting that they were compelled to do?
It's such an important point, because so for instance, Vincent Sheehan, the author of Personal History, he is born and raised in the mining town of Pana, Illinois. Or, Bill Shire is from Cedar Rapids. I mean, he's born in Chicago, but he grows up in Cedar Rapids. Or Eric Severide is born in Velva, North Dakota. So, right, these are the Maurer brothers, also in Illinois, in small town Illinois. So I think there are two things that are really important here. One of them is that they have a very good sense of what their readers want to know, that they have this very finely tuned perception for the American newspaper reading audience, because these are their neighbors, right? These are the people whom they know. And then secondly, they have a kind of irreverence that I think you have when you don't come from the establishment, right? They're sort of outsiders. And even when they're rich and famous and international celebrities, they still think about themselves as being outcasts. There's something that they preserve that sense of on the outside looking in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the sense that I got, this idea of an outsider looking in, which I think when you were doing journalism is a really valuable perspective to have. So what was correspondence culture like during this time? What was the Hotel Imperial, and how did an average, let's start there. What was the Hotel Imperial?
What is the Hotel Imperial?
Right. Exactly. How does it figure in this?
Yeah, really, right. Let's just start right with the title. So the Hotel Imperial still exists. It is one of the fanciest hotels in Vienna, and it was one of the correspondents' hangouts. So the reason the Hotel Imperial, though, is also in the title is it is the place that Hitler, as a young failed art student, is shoveling snow outside of the doors of the Hotel Imperial, while all the fancy people, all sort of Vienna high society, come in and attend a ball. And he has the classic cast off feeling that here are these people, and what do they care for someone like me? The Hotel Imperial's management doesn't even send out coffee, a hot coffee, to these men who are shoveling the snow. So when the Anschluss happens in 38, where does Hitler go? First of all, he does not go to the Chancellery. The big cars roll right up to the Hotel Imperial, and that's where he pitches his camp for, you know, the sort of early days of the Anschluss. And so the Hotel Imperial is both a real location. It's where reporters hung out, just like the diamond merchants and the turpentine merchants. Everyone's hanging out at the Hotel Imperial, and the Montenegrin bandits, and everyone's there. But it's also symbolic in the sense that the last call at the Hotel Imperial is the ways in which people found themselves saying goodbye to Vienna as a place that they would once, that they knew, you know, in the mid-30s.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so correspondent culture. What's correspondent culture? Correspondent culture. So one of the things that the journalists in this book did is that they take what is the kind of argot and the lingo and the stories that reporters would be trading with each other in cafes and bars and places where they hung out, and they turn them into material for their stories and eventually for their books. And some of this stuff is the kind of stuff that their editors, you know, on the newspapers say, like, well, I'm not going to print that. We can't print that. That's not proper news. But it's the sorts of things that they're interested in. And some of what they're interested in are this kind of personal origins of these stories. So these are people who have grown up in the shadow of Freudian ideas. Some of them are analyzed. They all know certainly Freudian ideas. H.R. Knickerbocker, who's one of these journalists whom I write about, he grows up in Yoakum, Texas, and he works on big city papers until he decides, you know, he's not going to be a journalist anymore. He's going to go to Munich and become a psychiatrist. So he gets back into journalism when he's sitting there when he walks by the beer hall putsch, basically, and decides, you know, here, as you said, Shelley, it's the sense of really there on the spot. So there's Knickerbocker, he walks past the beer hall putsch and becomes a reporter again. But that psychiatric interest, the interest in human motivation, is the kind of stuff that they're talking about at late at night in the reporters' bars, and they're trading rumors like Hitler has a mother complex, don't you know? What about Hitler's Oedipus complex? Or they're, you know, cracking jokes about the Polish dictator Pilsudski's maniacal rages and his scatological talk. Or they are, you know, they're retailing all the sort of gossip that they knew. So the reporters' bars, if you walked into such a place, that's the kind of stuff that you would hear.
And then what would their process be in terms of like filing a story, you know, how, I mean, technology, of course, then was very different than now. So just like logistically, what is it going to look like to get a story out?
Completely. A lot of times the reporters' bars are actually located, as was true of Vienna's Café Louvre, across from the city's telegraph and telephone agency, so that you could rush you know, right across the street and file your story. So, okay, so technologically, the situation is pretty interesting. So in the 20s, when these people go off to Europe and Asia, there are basically two ways that you file your story back at home in the US. One of them is that you can wire it back, so cable it back, but that is hugely expensive. So and you're always using these kinds of strange abbreviations, which means that oftentimes the story that gets printed in the newspaper will have the name of a river inserted or something unintelligibly. They're always complaining about how everything is screwed up because of the cable use. Or you can mail it back, and that's for a story that's not urgent, but is a kind of a color piece. Like John Gunther writes one about you know, the different kinds of coffee that you can drink in Vienna, or the delicacies of restaurants in Budapest. And so that could take, you know, maybe 2 months to appear in the paper. So that's like the, you know, really slow way to do it. But by the early 1930s, they actually have the possibility of something else, which has pretty big ramifications for the way in which they're reporting, and that is telephoning your story in. So you could call it into your story into usually the bureau in Paris or the bureau in London. And the key thing here and the important consequence is that it's very difficult to shut a reporter down, a foreign reporter down, because they have already told the story. They've already dictated their story. And what is, sometimes you can hear if you're reporting from Moscow, you can hear the click on the telephone of the, Soviet spy man listening in. But it's very hard to keep you from actually getting that story through, unless, of course, all of the telephone lines are turned off in the entire country. And that is exactly what happens in Austria in 1934 during the so-called February Civil War, when the Austro-fascist dictator Engelbert Dollfuss opens fire on the socialist housing projects. They close all of the phone lines.
Wow. Does that, so you kind of touch on the idea of censorship there. What sort of censorship did they face, either from, you say like, well, their editors say like, no, I'm not printing that. But what about, they had to be, especially as we get deeper into the 30s, angering the powers that be in the countries that they're reporting from. So what did that look like?
It was really difficult to censor them once they got their stories through, because of course you can't censor someone else's papers. All you can do is you can throw the reporter out. And that is precisely what happens to Dorothy Thompson. So in 34, Dorothy Thompson, who has written not just some of the early reports about after the Nazis come to power, in 33, she writes a whole series called Hitler the Menace for the Jewish press, and basically about people being beaten up, gathering up reports from the hospitals. So she then is thrown out of Nazi Germany in the summer of 1934. She's the first American foreign correspondent to be expelled from the country because, they can't stand her reporting. They've threatened a number of other Americans before then, including Edgar Maurer, who finally leaves the country because the American ambassador says, you better get out of here. And they had also threatened Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker would end up being expelled from the country. And all of these people end up on, the blacklists of the people who the Nazis are going to, take out when they invade England.
Well, it's so interesting to see that, we of course know how the story ends, but, as you're like the historical, we know who's gonna, when Hitler's coming to power, we know how that story ends. But I think, one of the real exciting things about your book is how the reader experiences it as these people were. It's sort of, history unfolding. And I'm sure you hear this saying all the time, like journalism being the first draft of history. And I think your work illustrates that so well. And the ways in which they have first impressions, they have guesses, sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the first impressions of Hitler, Thompson's versus Knickerbocker's, because I thought that was a really fascinating contrast between those two.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. I'm so glad that you thought that about the book, because that was for me the thing that was so fascinating about doing the research, because I would find myself sort of thinking, wow, I had never thought about it this way. I had never thought that, February in 1934 in Vienna, the Austrian Civil War would be such a turning point in the minds of people who lived through it, because it gets, on top of everything else that happens, you sort of forget who cares about that anymore. So one of the things that is very difficult for them to figure out at first is the nature of modern dictatorship, because they have all sorts of ideas about it. Maybe Hitler and Mussolini are actually going to destroy each other. Maybe that is, the Western powers can just sit on the sidelines and watch these two men who seem actually mostly to have it out for each other at first, destroy each other. So Knickerbocker, he sees Hitler at the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. He interviews him a couple of times, and he is very astute about the danger that the Nazi leader poses. So when he first sees him, he says, he looked like some kind of like a second-rate Texas attorney general. I mean, I was a district attorney, you know, in a cheap suit, and he looked, in other words, like a mediocrity. But very quickly, he's reporting, this man is really a danger. We got to watch out for this guy. And his fellow, you know, critics of Knickerbocker's in the daily papers say, what is Knickerbocker going on about? What is wrong with him? Why does he think he's, you know, just sensationalizing his reports? He just wants more people to read them. So he's making a big deal about this Hitler fellow. But of course, he was absolutely right. But Thompson, who's an equally astute observer of the European scene, in 1931 finally gets to see Hitler. She's actually been trying to get to see him as well since the beer hall putsch, but Hitler doesn't really like seeing foreign reporters, and he has no interest in seeing lady reporters, for sure, unlike Mussolini, who liked lady reporters, by the way. And so Hitler, she meets him finally, and she says, you know, I thought I was going to be really impressed by this man, but almost immediately, I saw him for what he is, which is he's nothing. He's a nobody. He's an agitator genius. He's someone who can rile a lot of people up, but he'll never amount to anything. As soon as he comes to power, he'll be crushed by the established parties. And she makes various digs at him. She says things like, oh, he crooks his little finger when he sips his tea, in reference to him, to the rumors about homosexuality in the Nazi party. So it's a huge miscalculation. She always hates being reminded of it, right? It's completely embarrassing. And then of course, she spends the rest of the 1930s essentially reporting on the dangers of Hitler, trying to raise the alarm in America, trying to stir Americans to action towards intervention in the European war.
I think it was just that contrast between this woman seeing him for, like, completely being unimpressed in a one-on-one situation, because we of course know the Hitler that fills stadiums and that practices his speeches, and every gesture is coordinated so that there is this impressive character that's created. And then to hear that when he's one-on-one, he really struggled, and that, you know, especially like the description of him, you know, trying to answer some questions, but then like, no, I'm just going to look at the ceiling and go on my riff because that's what I do. And that she sees this, well, like, this isn't impressive. This is, you know,
right. This is a man who can actually respond to things.
Right. And by seeing through him, actually misses the danger because other people didn't see that part of him.
That is a perfect way of putting it, actually. You know, her strength was also her weakness in that moment, which was she was so well connected in German political and intellectual society. So it's, you know, she has the normal German problem in a way. How could, in the land of Goethe and Einstein and Thomas Mann, how could such a mediocrity come to power? Impossible. But then she also has, she's got too much knowledge of the context, and she just gets it wrong. And part of what the book is really trying to do is to show how you do get it wrong. You write the first draft of history, inevitably you're going to get it wrong. And they argue with each other. So Knickerbocker gets dressed down by Dorothy Thompson in the 1930s when she's becoming a political columnist and he's still being a newspaper man traipsing around. And she says, you know, Knickerbocker is a very talented man. She's also probably had an affair with him. So who knows what's actually else is going on. But she says he's a very talented man. But really, when he goes to these chancelleries, he's not reporting, he's not analyzing, he's just taking dictation. He's just telling what's been said to him. And of course, he's, you know, gravely affronted.
Yeah, that's a interesting, the dynamic that plays out between, that they're also very well aware of these differences that they had and are commenting on that. That must have been very, as a, you know, historian, and then, or, you know, to write about it must have been very exciting to be focused on people who are so prolific. Could you maybe talk about the process of how you use these sources, decided what you were going to include?
Yeah, so they are, other than Sheehan and Knickerbocker, so many of the figures who I worked on have huge archives. I mean, archives of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boxes. Like the Gunther archive is more than 250 boxes. Some of them are like, you know, filing boxes, just huge. in some cases, they saved everything, or seemed to have saved everything, right? Diaries and letters and letters and little tiny pieces of paper on which they had written their inner thoughts. Notes, verbatim notes that are taken, you know, in everything from an argument with a friend to a relationship with your mistress to interviewing Trotsky. So what I wanted to do was really give the reader the sense that I had sitting in that archive. And you know how it is, right? Which is that you sit there and you think there's a closeness to the past. And I wanted to be able to convey that and to give you that sense of conversations that are ongoing and people who are trying to figure things out. And the figuring things out is not just, you know, what's Trotsky's next step, or what is Stalin really up to, or when is war going to break out, or, you know, does Haile Selassie have a chance to defend against, you know, Abyssinia against Mussolini, but also, how do I really feel about my husband? Is my marriage like an empire? You know, all the kinds of questions that John Gunther's wife, Frances, is asking herself as all of them begin to feel the distance between their own inner lives and geopolitics completely crumbling.
Were there ever moments where, and you have to say what they were, but were there moments that you came across things and you thought, wow, this is incredible, but maybe this is too personal to include, or, you know, something like that, that you maybe had a dilemma as a, you know, this fits the story, but I'm sure you became quite close to these people, as you do when you're researching. They become really real people to you. So I think there's a sense to sometimes also protect.
Yes, no, I think that's very right. And one doesn't want, I think, especially in a biographical mode, when you're working with the kind of the complexities and the honest struggles of people's lives, you also don't want them to be judged, you know, for a kind of comment that, you know, if you've read 200,000 pieces of paper, is sort of not in character. So I do think that is, you pinpoint exactly a dilemma. So I sort of evolved a rule, which was I didn't want to write, there's a lot of personal stuff in these papers. I didn't want to write stuff that wasn't relevant to the main dilemmas that they struggled with. But at the same time, because they, in their own reporting on these, you know, outsized political figures, are constantly trying to assess the relationship between, you know, someone's upbringing or someone's marriage and the kinds of political actions that they're taking. And because all of that dynamic that they're trying to figure out between personal life and political decision making is coming back in their own lives as well. That had to be a key strand of the book, because you really couldn't understand what they were up to. And in a sense, what their writerly project was, which was to bring forth all of these sorts of things that people actually didn't talk about. So they write about homosexuality, they write about sex, they write about affairs, they write about illegitimacy, they write about illness, and they write about death. And each one of those subjects was really quite shocking for their readers and their editors. And in some cases, like John Gunther's Death Be Not Proud, his publisher thought, we cannot publish this book. This is way too intimate. And he insisted, it must be published. It must be published.
Yeah, it's just such an interesting, and you know, those details, like I think I said earlier, really give it such a personal quality that you can see them as whole people. It must have been very difficult for them to have any sense of separation between their professional lives and their personal lives. What was the toll that their work took on their personal lives? Because sort of by the, you know, the end of, you know, once they come out of the war, they are very different people than those correspondents that packed up to talk about Europe so many years before.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So a huge, huge toll. And I think there are three things there that are really important. One of them is that the toll is about trying to predict what's going to happen next. So it's like a version of the reporter's dilemma, which is you have to be in the right place. And so how do you know what's going to happen? And that's so stressful. Another problem is the problem of the bystander, the witness. So you're Dorothy Thompson and you're going and interviewing these people, you know, Jews who've been beaten up and who are terrified for their lives. And you have all of what we know happens with war reporters now, right? The terrible kind of bystander problem, the witnessing problem. And then third, there's the sense of something else, which is if you feel like, you're asking yourself questions like, is my husband like Hitler or am I like Hitler? That there's a kind of immediacy to those dilemmas that is also incredibly stressful. So what happens is they drink, they have affairs, they do all the kinds of stuff that you do when, there you are living in the most exigent, grab for everything moment. And we know this, for instance, about the Blitz during the Second World War, right? That this was this time when all the rules of marriage went right out the window for lots and lots of people. Or as the photographer Lee Miller said to John Gunther, the great thing about the Blitz is no one ever asks you where you are because you can oftentimes not get home. So you never have to be at home.
Yeah. You're saying this mention of the reporter's dilemma also made me think about in terms of how they saw their role, and they're both reporting on something to give us, what the real story is, the objective truth, if we can use that word, but also they want to create some sort of change in many cases. And to me, this reminded me a lot of the role of a historian, that we too are charged with, objectively reporting the past. And yet in a modern context, we're often, it is our charge to then apply what we know of the past to encourage change in the future. So I wonder if you could speak on that a little bit.
Gosh, I think that's such a good question. And you're putting your finger on something that is absolutely crucial, which is that, they want to be their eyewitnesses, but they also want to change what's happening, which is the reason why someone like Thompson becomes, she's a political columnist, or Gunther's writing books and Sheehan's writing books, as Knickerbocker's appearing in newsreels. And they're doing that because they feel like they have to take action, that it's not enough just to write, that they want to actually be in the midst of everything. Or Francis Gunther, another very good example, who joins the Indian nationalist movement and becomes one of the really, really important people who was arguing for an end to the British Empire in India during the Second World War. And then she also becomes a Zionist and joins the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, and is really one of the people with Ben Hecht, who is behind the scenes, kind of turning the Bergson Boys campaign into something that's going to be palatable to American observers. She actually testifies in Congress about the Emergency Committee's efforts. So, right, the historian's dilemma by comparison is small, I think, by comparison to the journalist's dilemma, because I think many of us want to tell, and I don't know if this is true for you too, Shelley, but you want to tell what you think is a useful history, but you also want to convey all the complexity of that history, which oftentimes makes it less useful. Or you come to arguments that are not actually what you politically believe. Like my first book was about the ways in which the British were able to get out of paying really significant pensions to disabled veterans after the First World War, because they could rely on a huge charitable infrastructure, whereas the Germans paid the Weimar Republic had very generous pensions and shut all the charities down, and they ended up with a worse result. And I, believe in charity, but I also think that if you send someone out to fight and die for the state, you better pay them a good pension. So, but my work, in a sense, made the opposite argument, which was if you had a robust charitable sector, that you could get away without paying state pensions. And I kept always saying, this is not in politics. This is actually my historical argument. So I think that is a dilemma.
Well, it's, especially as, the complex times that we live in now, and as someone who, studies, the 30s and 40s, I'm often asked, how can we apply this? And I do feel as a historian of this period, it's my job to make some sort of educated comparison. But then, of course, there is that tricky line that, there's comparison within reason. So it's, to me, it's one of those things that does make it difficult, because we want to have a usable past. And
right.
Yet that comparison can be so deeply abused, especially by people who are not doing it responsibly.
Yes, no, I think that's put perfectly.
All right, I think we can transition to the Q&A portion. So Ethan has put there in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we can communicate them.
And if anybody here in the room has a question, feel free to raise your hand. Our groups are very shy for some reason when it gets to this. We know when you're in person, you're all very, very engaged. So
Engaged, right.
Feel free to ask some questions.
Are you seeing any pop up?
Not yet.
Okay, well, I will ask one while we're waiting,
Oh,
unless someone in the room has one. One of the quotes that really stood out to me was Thompson saying, "Nazism has nothing to do with race or nationality. It appeals to a certain type of mind." And in line with what I have just said about applying the past to the present, any comments you might like to make about, her view then and lessons for today?
Yeah, she writes this really wonderful piece called "Who Goes Nazi?" And what she's trying to say, and this is the same thing, so she's married to the writer Sinclair Lewis, is her second husband, and he writes "It Can't Happen Here," really directly propelled by the conversations that he's overhearing or participating in at the dinner table. And what Thompson wants to say to Americans is, yes, we have a democratic culture. Yes, we have a certain kind of political tradition, but look around you. And she says, go to your next party and look around and see who the woman is who's laughing a little bit too loudly and is a little bit too close and desiring to impress the powerful man. Well, she would go Nazi. Or look at the hail fellow well met who's sitting in the corner, and he feels a little kind of hard done by his circumstances. Well, he'd certainly go Nazi. And then Dorothy Thompson, like she says, but the man who is modest and who has a good character, she is, after all, the daughter of a minister, Dorothy Thompson. So she really believes in, good character. That person will never go Nazi, no matter how much you force them into that situation. So what she's trying to do, right, is to say that, yes, there are particular political reasons why Nazism could become ascendant and could spread in Germany, but there are characterological reasons as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we did have a question, Dr. Cohen, about Ruth Gruber, sorry. And if you could share, I know that Marge shared that her daughter was her college roommate.
Yes, this is Ruth Gruber, the Weiterleben woman, or is that?
I'm sure, looking for a clarification from Marge. Maybe she can fill us in the chat or unmute herself and share.
I don't remember.
I guess what I'm wondering is, are we talking about the memoirist, or is it
Was someone who was featured in recently in the Ken Burns documentary?
Yes.
Oh, right, which I'm so sorry I was saying this actually to Dr. Klein, which is I'm chairing my department, and I just feel like among the many things I have not done that I want to do is watch the Ken Burns documentary. So I have not seen it, though two of my colleagues, okay, she was a journalist and reporter. Yeah, two of my colleagues, Peter Hayes and Danny Green, are both featured in there. Yeah, I didn't do any work on her myself, so I can't speak to that. But again, it goes to the question of the prominence of women reporters. And I've just read a really wonderful book that's coming out next month by a historian at Madison, in the journalism school, named Catherine McGarr. And it's about the foreign policy journalists of Washington in the 1940s and 50s. And one of the things that she's arguing is that the kind of heterogeneity that I'm describing as part of this foreign correspondent world then ceases to exist after the war. And that it becomes a white world, a male world, and one that's organized by clubland, and with plenty of people who are smart and they know what's going on, but the range of what they're going to report is pretty narrow. And it's these are the moments when Dorothy Thompson, talking to John Gunther, says that, honey, we were outcasts, because she's really comparing those sort of establishment types to their group of rabble-rousing foreign correspondents, getting thrown out of places. Frances Gunther, who's John Gunther's wife, comes to have a really close friendship with the Indian nationalist leader Nehru. So she is fully, as I said, she's becoming this really important person in Indian nationalism in the United States. They're constantly crossing the boundaries of what we would consider to be objective journalism into much more subjective and engaged journalism, where, just like Dr. Klein said, they want to take part in the activities. They want to change history. They don't just want to report on what's going on.
That's interesting. That I wondered about that as you talked about this space that like women had, and there was this space for outcasts. I wondered if, in fact, because it seemed like just anecdotally what I know about what comes later for reporting, that space then closed up after the war.
Absolutely, it does. And partly because it gets a little bit more regularized, institutionalized. It becomes, foreign reporting becomes, a plum job, something that you get, at that, when you're up on the totem pole of the newsroom. It also becomes, the prevailing ethos and the sort of emotional style is detached. If we think about realism in American foreign policy, it's a detached, objective, none of this emotional stuff. Dorothy Thompson is always going on and on about the survival of civilization and mothers and babies and those sorts of subjects. And that is absolutely not what the, Scotty Reston or the kind of foreign policy elite reporters are talking about. And just it serves to, I think it's useful to say that Dorothy Thompson's column in the New York Herald Tribune alternates with the columns of Walter Lippmann. Who do we remember? Walter Lippmann. Dorothy Thompson was far, far more widely read in the 30s than Lippmann was. But Lippmann establishes himself as a kind of objective, detached, wise old head.
We have a question from Ellen Portnoy, who actually is going to be moderating our event next week. So she's got questions already. She said, I was interested in the early chapters, the events that happened with the reporters in Palestine and their positive feelings for the Mufti and not for the Jews. And wondering if you might speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so all of the reporters in the book report on Nazi crimes against Jews in the early 30s. However, the chapters that you're talking about, so they are also fierce anti-imperialists. So John Gunther, but especially Vincent Sheehan. So Vincent Sheehan is one of the very few reporters on the spot in 1929 at the Western Wall disturbances of 1929. And he has been sent actually to Palestine by the Zionist news organization, because he's understood to be someone who really is interested in Jews and Jewish subjects. And he gets there and his opinion begins to shift, and he starts to think, what is happening here? This looks like an imperial situation. Here are all of these settlers who are coming in, and what is going to happen to the people who, the Arabs, of Jerusalem? And he doesn't get answers that satisfy him. And so he files a set of very critical reports in 1929. And as you say, critics accuse him of being, taking entirely the Mufti's position. And there are protests against him. The papers that are reporting his stories get a lot of angry mail. In Louisville, which is where I grew up, the rabbis are giving speeches against him. I mean, I know that from the Louisville papers. So, this is one of the things that's intriguing about this group of people, which is, as they would have said themselves, there are no reporters who are stauncher in their reporting about anti-Semitic attacks against Jews in Europe. And yet, certainly, Sheehan and Gunther in 1929 are extraordinarily critical, and as is Dorothy Thompson after the Second World War, similarly critical about the state of Israel.
Oh, yes, please. We have one question here in the room.
One of the things that interested me in the book was the concept of authority complex, explaining possibility with the fascination of the people of the time between fascism and communism. And to put that in context, it's a little complicated what I'm saying with the fact of what's happening today politically in the world. I want you to comment on that.
Yeah, so what you're referring to that moment, right, where Wilhelm Stekel, who's one of Freud's first students and really becomes Freud's first apostate as well. So Freud totally disowns Stekel. Stekel pioneers something that he calls the quick cure in psychoanalysis. But Stekel has an idea that what is going wrong in Europe is something that he calls the authority complex. And what he says is all of these young men have come back from the war and their fathers have betrayed them, or they never went to the war because they were too young to have gone to the war. And they see, defeated, beat up men, and they ally themselves to the dictator because they feel that he is the powerful person, right? In a landscape of weak fathers, here is the powerful father. And so Hitler knows how to capitalize on that. He knows how to say, you, as this is from Knickerbocker's notes. So John Gunther and Knickerbocker are talking about what is Hitler's secret. And Knickerbocker says, he says to those throngs of people, those roaring crowds of the stadium, he says, you have been badly treated. And I know that, and you know that, but you've been trying to pretend that you haven't been badly treated. You have been totally screwed over, and I am here to stand up for you finally. And, the contemporary parallel, of course, the contemporary resonance is chilling. And I think when you say the authority complex too, you point to what feel like some kind of personality structures that are enduring to explain radicalization. And so people who, I'm thinking about my colleague, Kathleen Ballou, who works on, extremism, radicalization. And some of those same kinds of dynamics are absolutely at play. Stekel says something else that I think is really interesting and that I thought about a lot, which is he says to John Gunther says, well, but why do people want to surrender their own autonomy to a dictator? And Stekel says, what you have to understand is that the people don't want to be free. They want to be frightened. They want to be afraid. That there's something about being afraid that is itself really seductive. And, seems resonant enough.
Which is very scary.
Yeah, really scary.
Others? I just I was curious if there were any stories that you wanted to put in, like little anecdotes that you wanted to put in, but just you couldn't quite fit, but might be just like a personal favorite of yours.
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, yes, I've got one. So John Gunther, when he was a young man, and he had throngs of girlfriends, and then he also had girls whom he really admired. So he was famous for sending these love letters, and he would send this, he was a writer, but why reinvent the wheel? He would send the same love letter to 6 women. Once he sent one accidentally to G.K. Chesterton, the British writer and critic, with a line that said, your eyelashes are like little fringed fans. And Chesterton sent it back to him. He was trying to get an interview with Chesterton, and that was he hadn't sent the interview, may I please have an interview with you, Mr. Chesterton, it would be the making of me. Instead, he sent the eyelashes like little fringe fans. So that was funny enough, but actually the funnier part, and this isn't in the book, is that Nehru, who is kind of romancing Francis Gunther, the Gunthers are on a tour through Asia in 1937, 1938, and Nehru, they meet, all of the nationalists are very eager to court American journalists. And Nehru actually introduces John Gunther, and it's the first time that Nehru has appeared on radio is when he introduces John Gunther. At any rate, Nehru, in his romancing of Francis Gunther, sends her peel of kind of Himalayan birch bark that he includes in a letter. So then I'm reading, Neru's most famous romance, probably Platonic, just like the one with Francis Gunther, is with Edwina Mountbatten, the wife of, Lord Mountbatten, and who presides over the dissolution of the British Empire in India. And what does Nehru send her? He sends her a little kind of peel of Himalayan birch bark, the same trick. And you think, really, did no man in the 1920s and 30s, did not reuse his lines and his love letters? I mean, all the way from John Gunther as a callow young man sitting in Chicago to Nehru, who's already a sophisticate, who's sending around his birch bark. God knows how many other women got birch bark from Nehru. But
That's a great one.
that was, I just couldn't
I like
fit it
that.
in because I think I put in the birch bark, but not the continued sending of birch bark.
Yeah, the continuances. Yeah, that's funny. I have one. I have one final thing, and that is, what do you see the legacy of these individuals to modern journalism?
Mm-hmm. So I think there are two things. One of them is that they pioneer what we think about as the techniques of the new journalism. So when the new journalists come around in the 1960s and 1970s, a lot of the stuff that they claim that they are innovating, like Joan Didion or Tom Wolfe, or what they say is, fly on the wall, subjective reporting, you were there, all that stuff is being done in the 20s and 30s by these people, and these people in their sort of broader circle. So a lot of what we think about as those techniques of subjective kind of engaged journalism are being done. So that was their legacy, although not much of a legacy, because of course it gets forgotten and then has to be rediscovered. I think the more significant legacy is this legacy that they leave in terms of two really striking memoirs that come directly out of this group. So this small little group of 4 journalists. One of them is Death Be Not Proud, which is at the time an absolutely taboo path-breaking book, hasn't been done before, a secular account of illness and death. And, if you think about the illness metaphor as a genre of writing, it really starts there, the modern illness metaphor. And then the second book is the one that Vincent Sheehan writes about his friends, Dorothy Thompson and the writer Sinclair Lewis. And that book, Dorothy in Red, which is published in 1964 and is called the frankest memoir of marriage ever published. So there's a legacy of writing about taboo subjects, of making a claim that you actually have to speak about these things. So Sheehan's book about Dorothy in Red is, it has affairs. Of course, it has Dorothy Thompson's affair with a woman. It has drunkenness on both of their parts, especially on Sinclair Lewis's part. It has domestic violence. All of that is in there. And really, readers are quite shocked. I mean, of course, they're very interested in it. And when the publisher gets the book, at first they think, again, like, oh God, can we publish this? And then pretty soon they're advertising it as the frankest memoir of the frankest book about modern marriage ever published. So I think that's also their legacy.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Ethan?
All right. Well, Dr. Cohen, Dr. Klein, thank both of you so very much for joining us this evening and for really a riveting conversation about, I should add, a fantastic book. If you have not picked up a copy, certainly encourage you, for those of you virtually, and for everybody else in your email, a link to purchase it from Dr. Cohen's favorite bookstore in Chicago, Underbridge Bookstore. We always like to support local bookstores when we have the opportunity to. And also just want to remind you that next week we'll be back together on Thursday evening to welcome journalist Gabrielle Glasser in conversation with Ellen Portnoy about her book, American Baby, which, to give a very quick preview, is a book very much written about the intersection of adoption and abortion in pre-rural America. And actually part of the book takes place here in Kansas City. So a local connection to that book talk. We'd love to see you. And thank you all for joining us. Look forward to seeing you at future events, and have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you again so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Klein. Those were really fantastic and engaged questions. Really.
Well, thank you. It was It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Made me think I'm registering for the American Baby one because I really want to hear that.
I'll send you the link.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Ciao. Bye bye. Thank you again for having me. Bye
Right.
bye.
I